Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Dorie Clark, and I am here on behalf of Newsweek. We are doing a special feature during the month of February called Creating the Economy of the Future. This is a special program presented by the government of Japan. And today we are here with Ulrike Schaede. She is a professor at the University of California, San Diego. And we are going to be talking about the economy, about business, and about reinventing the economy of Japan and what we can all learn from it. Ulrike, wonderful to have you here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Wonderful. And for all of you who are tuning in live, please feel free to type into the chat box and let us know who you are, where you're dialing in from. And throughout the course of the next 45 minutes that we're going to be spending together, we're glad to take your questions as well from Ulrike, and we can learn from her about all the things that we need to know about future economic trends and how we can get smarter in responding to them and apply them in our own businesses and in our own careers. So Ulrike, the first question that I have for you, this is something that, even for people who don't necessarily have a huge knowledge of Japanese business, one of the things that I think is most remarkable and interesting, certainly for Americans, because, our country is not that old, is that for many Japanese businesses, there's a tradition of businesses that literally have been around for hundreds of years. It's not uncommon to have a business that has been around 800 years, which sounds astounding. Can you talk a little bit more about that phenomenon? Why is that a thing? How have they been able to keep that going? And what can we learn from that?
Well, that's a great question. And actually, people have done research on this to figure this out. First of all, as you just said, America is not that old. So we do have companies in this country that are 100 years old, like half of the, or a third of the lifespan of the entire country. So we do have a little bit of that. But there's also a bigger reason, and that is that Japanese companies have traditionally been managed to live for over 100 or 1,000 years. Right? There is a deep appreciation of the idea that companies should not die. I mean, if you think about why humans, have to pass, it's because our cell structure stops working and we're not reproducing, the cells that we need. But companies aren't like that, right? They're building blocks, and companies have assets that you can build and buy with money and replace. So there's actually fundamentally no reason why a company should ever go bankrupt if it is managed well and if it is managed for, creating value and innovation for the long run. So then it becomes interesting, right? So why is Japan doing this and America isn't? And the answer is that over the past 30 or 40 years, the United States has turned to the stock market. We now have a lot of companies in this country that are managed towards quarterly earning reports. Their CEOs are incentivized, for better or for worse, by the way. It's not that one system is better than the other. They both have their advantages. But in the United States, CEOs are incentivized to make sure that the stock price is always on the up. And if it isn't, then all hell breaks loose, and it's all over the news. And the company didn't, match its quarterly earnings forecast. And what's wrong? And by the way, also, US CEOs are paid in stock options. So they're really interested in this high stock price. Right? In contrast, Japanese CEOs are not paid in stock options. And as you may know, Japan had its own sort of scandal and bubble economy in the late 80s and early 90s. And in the process, people learned that the stock price is not always the best indicator of the quality of a company. So there is much less of an embrace of the short-term, win, sort of create immediate result thing. And there's much more of a patience with Japanese companies that are saying, okay, we're going to, invest in innovation. We're going to train our people. We're going to reinvest in the company. And the stock market used to like that. And it's changing in Japan now, but it's not nowhere close to the United States, where the average lifespan of a U.S. company to be lifespan in terms of being included in the S&P 500 used to be over 50 years and is now less than 10 years, right? And so, and in Japan, you are right. If you look at the Nikkei 225 index, there are lots of companies that look on paper as if they were founded in 1946. That's just because after World War II, they had to re-register. But some of them are actually going back to, the Meiji years or even longer, right into the 17th century. So it's a difference in philosophy of what businesses should do, who businesses are run for. Are they run for shareholders or stakeholders or employees? And a whole different way of doing business as a result of that.
That's really fascinating. Thank you, Ulrike. We are here with Ulrike Schaede. She's a professor at the University of California, San Diego. If you want to learn more about her work, go to thejapanologist.com. That is her website, and you can check out her research and her writing there. And we'd love to hear who you are. Please feel free to type into the chat box. Let us know who you are and where you're tuning in from, and any questions that you have for Ulrike about the economy, about what's going on, about the future of Japanese business, and what we can all learn from it. So, Ulrike, I want to dig down on something that you were alluding to earlier, which I think is interesting. So, obviously, in the 1980s, the Japanese economy was incredibly high flying. And then the economy there for a pretty long time, I mean, actually, multiple decades, entered a period of recession, of very slow growth, and that's something that certainly is alarming to consider for people in the United States who are so used to the stock market ticking up and up and up and up, which perhaps itself might be unsustainable. What was it exactly? For those of us who unlike you, have not spent decades studying and becoming an expert in Japan and Japanese economics, what exactly happened? What was it that caused this this recession? Why was it so hard to shake? And what are the lessons that we can all learn from it today?
So there are a couple of reasons, and so let me just see whether I can structure my answer to make this concise, because I could give a whole lecture on this, right? So Japan had a bubble economy between 1987 and roughly 1991, where stock prices went through the roof and real estate prices went through the roof. Think of that as Japan's equivalent to our global financial crisis of 2008. Okay, so this whole thing was a delirious. It was a lot of fun, we were sprinkling gold on salad leaves and stuff. So it was a lot of fun, but it couldn't go on forever because it was built on a house of cards. There were false valuations of real estate that were then becoming the collateral of land, and then that was false, and so eventually this whole thing went up into hot air, and the stock market collapsed, and the banking system came under tremendous pressure, similar to our, as I just said, our Lehman shock, as the Japanese call it, in 2008, 2009. The Japanese government at that point made a choice, and the choice was that they would not do radical surgery, but that they would band-aid this thing, that they would try. First of all, there was denial, so it wasn't really a choice. Hey, let's they would say, well, let's just wait a couple of years, and all of this will be cleaned up because our banks are strong and our companies are strong. Let's just wait and let them quietly, kind of refinance these loans that had gone bad and so forth, and then the economy will come back. And that didn't happen. And then came a realization that something fundamentally new had happened to the economy, namely that it was embarking on a very different growth trajectory. That sort of the high growth era of the post-war years, where Japan was selling consumer end products into global markets, especially the United States, was kind of over, because at the same time, South Korea and Taiwan had figured out how to make consumer electronics and even cars, right? So the Japanese economy suddenly was also under a competitive shock. And then came this choice moment in the late 1990s, when the Japanese government decided that they wouldn't do what the US did with Lehman, but that they would rather phase out the the banks and consolidate them and merge them and keep the savers' deposits safe. And so you could, look back on that and say, well, that was clearly a policy mistake. They should have just, cleaned this thing up already and move on with life. But on the other hand, Japan went through this entire 2 decades of low growth with almost, comparatively, that's it, almost no increase in unemployment. And that's because there was a choice made that we will not let our largest companies go bankrupt. They will get these loans that came to be called zombie loans, right? So there was a bank lending to companies that would otherwise, have gone bust. And the whole purpose there was to maintain employment. Now, some economists will tell you that it's a really inefficient way to sustain employment, but society at large certainly benefited from that, right? Because people kept, not everybody, but a lot of people kept their jobs that would otherwise have lost it. People kept a purpose in life. They had to get up in the morning, they had to go to work. There's still the system of lifetime employment, which is now coming under pressure, but in any event, so there was again, this is this long-term thing. Let's see whether if we play this out a little bit longer, some companies may survive. And so what you get as a result, though, is 2 decades of nothing. And I'm not sure if we could turn the time back, whether Japan would make the same choice, but they made that choice at the time. So that's the outcome. But by the way, it also weren't 2 lost decades, but that maybe is a different question.
Yes, that's so interesting, Ulrike. Thank you for shedding light on that. We're here with Ulrike Schaede. She's a professor at the University of California, San Diego. Her website is The Japanologist, and we're talking about the business reinvention of Japan and creating the economy of the future. So, Ulrike, I'm excited to talk to you about the economy of the future. But before we do, I just temporarily wanted to enter a time machine and go back slightly to the period just before the sort of heating up, the incredible heating up in the late 80s of the Japanese economy. Now, as we were emerging from post-World War II, Japan, of course, was building just huge capacity and was becoming a kind of force to be reckoned with in terms of business processes and business excellence. And one of the interesting things in the early part of the 1980s in the United States was just the incredible concern that was arising because Japanese manufacturing in particular was just so much better than American processes at the time. And so we end up with American businesses really looking to Japanese peers, and Toyota, for instance, and the Toyota way was something that a lot of people learned from. And, for instance, just-in-time practices became looming very large in the American consciousness. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. What was that process like in terms of how Japan actually rebuilt and resculpted itself and achieved those levels of international excellence that we keep learning from? What was the Toyota way and its ilk all about, and why did it have such an impact?
So we have three things happening there between I would say the 50s and the 80s. After World War II, Japan's it was basically destroyed, and so there's a lot of scrambling for jockeying for position. So a lot of these small startup companies like Honda and Toyota and Sony started out, right? And then there were some pre-war companies that had a lot of technology. So sometimes people forget that before World War II, so the early part of the 20th century, Japan was already a large and functioning, economy with large companies. So, but at the time, before the war, Japan was basically exporting, textiles and mechanical toys and so forth. So your question really is, what happened after the war that Japan could rev up so fast and become basically America's favorite supplier of consumer end products? And the answer is that that there's a strength in Japan that actually is shared in some ways by Germany, maybe, in terms of engineering of and the meticulous execution of a production process, and attention to detail and a thoroughness with which things are built, and also maybe some ingenuity in how you build the entire manufacturing process. And by the way, this is true till today, right? So if you look at, if you look into the future later, we'll talk about digital manufacturing. It's Germany and Japan that's kind of really positioning to lead in that. So in the 60s and 70s, Japan was still sort of developing, and the first Datsuns that came to the United States there were jokes. Well, I bought a Japanese car and it rusted. Well, Datsun, right? And so they were learning, and then came the OPEC oil cartel in the 70s that basically undermined the U.S. way of thinking about cars, these large, beautiful, Cadillacs and Buicks and so forth. They were fundamentally gas guzzlers. And here came the small little Japanese cars. They were fantastically engineered. They would never break down, and they got a gas mileage like nobody else. So Americans fell in love with those cars. And then came Sony with its miniature radio, which was a similar thing. Sony had a core competence in miniaturization. The technology was originally from the United States, but Sony took it back to Japan and made a radio that we liked. And then came the electronics industry, right? So Sony and its Trinitron TV, and Panasonic, which developed the VHS, the videotape recorder. It was a Japanese invention. And they figured out how we could tape a football game of 3 hours and watch it later. And so we just embraced all of that, and the camcorder. And so those were the good old days, right? And then the fax machine, and, and then cameras. So Americans really liked that a lot. And Japan got better and better and better at making at a very high level of quality, no variance, very reliable, nifty consumer end products. And behind that is an education system that is very much about not making a mistake, not sticking out, not taking full responsibility for doing better, and in fact an excitement about doing something with perfection. And we see this, by the way, in Japanese art and things like the tea ceremony, where it's all about the ultimate expression is to do it to perfection. And it was this thing about perfection that really worked well in manufacturing and designing manufacturing processes, and that worked well to this day. And again, it's not as if this is all great, right? It also comes at a price. So what these companies were not so great at for a while was actually how to do this sort of Silicon Valley, break it, fix it, cutting edge, breakthrough innovation. That's very, it's happening now, but it's a more difficult thing to do. So what served the Japanese industry really well in the 1960s and 1970s was this willingness of every worker to be super meticulous about quality control, and then learn how to build this quality control into the manufacturing process, so that it wasn't like some supervisor looking down and blaming somebody for making a mistake. No, let's build this into the process of how we make things, so that at the end of the conveyor belt is the perfect camera or the perfect car or the perfect TV.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you, Ulrike. We're here with Ulrike Schaede. She's an expert on Japan and its economy. Her website is thejapanologist.com. You can learn more and check out her work there. So, Ulrike, one of the challenges that's facing pretty much every developed economy these days, but perhaps especially true in Japan, is the aging of the population. And this is something that has caused a lot of consternation among projections. How are we going to be paying for healthcare? How are we going to be paying for benefits? What is the latest on that situation as it affects the Japanese economy, and how can every advanced society be thinking about these questions, since it is a topic of demographic concern just about everywhere?
So yeah, it's interesting that it used to be that Japan was like 20 years behind, in the 20th century. But since the bubble economy, what we're learning is that Japan is actually 20 years ahead. So the bubble economy and the recession and dealing with this long financial recession at the turn of the century is what the U.S. then embarked on, in the 2010s, and maybe we're still kind of dealing with that a little bit, and so it is with aging. So no country is aging faster than Japan. By 2030, the Japanese workforce will shrink by about 20%, and by 2050, it'll be down 30%. This is something we can project well, because we know we can forecast with quite some accuracy how old people will be in 20 years from now and what the population will look like. So Japan is 20 years ahead of other places that are facing this, like China and Korea and Germany and France and also some other places in Asia. And so what Japan is doing with this aging thing is going to be an example for a lot of other places. But I also think that Japan is actually quite fortunate. And because for Japan, this aging and this labor shortage, this looming labor shortage, is happening at the exact same time as the digital transformation is going to hit us. And so that takes away a lot of the fears of replacement. So if you think about it, why are we worried about robots, or why are we worried about the digital transformation? Well, a number of things. We don't want to be run by machines. We don't want to, we would like to have recourse if somebody makes a decision. We don't want some AI or machine learning thing, determine whether we have access to credit or not. But we're also worried that the robot will arrive and take away jobs, right? And the self-driving car will take away the driver and that sort of thing. And in Japan, that fear is really not that pronounced. It's more like, when will we finally have machines that can make cars without people? Because we don't have people. And so the labor shortage that's hitting Japan is hitting Japan just at a time when the labor force is shrinking. And that changes the perception of what we can do with this digital transformation and how we can maybe employ the digital transformation as a solution to a lot of the problems that demographic change is bringing. Yeah. And so Japan is going to make, but there's no choice. They have to make some choices that we can then study later. America, of course, has a lot of immigration, so you could say, well, why wouldn't Japan just choose to let a lot of young immigrants in? Wouldn't that be a choice? And it is, but Japan is making a choice not to do that. But there is now a huge increase in immigration. So this is one of the choices. And so we can learn from Japan how to do that and think about immigration in a different way. But it's also that Japan is saying, well, we can just automate some of these processes, then we can address the labor shortage in a different way.
That's such an interesting point, that in many ways Japan is the laboratory of the future, because its trends are ahead of many other cultures, which will have to face them in relatively short order. So we have a comment coming in from Diane. Diane says, I think Ulrike makes an interesting point that it all starts with education. The respect for teachers and the crimes like littering are so different than in the United States. And I think, Diane is touching on something quite interesting. Ulrike, perhaps you can expand a little bit more about the Japanese education system, whether it's the kind of K-12 or the university education. What is the current thinking, and have things been reevaluated in recent years or not, with regard to the pipeline into jobs and careers, and how the Japanese educational system is changing or should change in order to better prepare people for the jobs of the future?
Well, that's a terrific question. So the education system itself is a reflection of something even deeper that's underlying this, and that's the social contract of what's important for our country, right? And there's some really interesting new research that gives us some tools to analyze this. And in particular, I'm using in my work now the what's called tight-loose theory, tight-loose. And this is a research by Michelle Gelfand at Stanford, who has done a lot of global work on different country cultures. And there's a lot of culture stuff going on, of course, but this particular framework looks at culture as a set of norms of behavior and measures to what extent people in a certain country or setting agree that certain behavioral prescriptions are important, and to what extent are they willing to punish deviance, right? And so she then defines this as either tight or loose. So let me give you an example. So California, where I am, is a very loose place. I mean, if I were to color my hair green tomorrow and go to school, students would say, well, that's cute, right? If a Japanese professor went to university with green hair, they would people would be worried. Is she okay? What's wrong with her? And so there are certain things that is just not done, and people in Japan can be pretty clear about that, right? And so Diane talks about littering. So the Tokyo is the largest metropolitan area in the world, and it's one of the cleanest and safest. How do you get that done? Well, you have some sort of agreement that there are certain norms of behavior, like littering is just not okay. You don't do it. And foreigners who come, so this is not innate, or this is not something that people learn even at school necessarily, because foreigners who live in Tokyo for a while stop littering, and they stop being noisy, and they stop doing they're adjust, right? And we do that because we want to fit in. Okay, so now you get the social proofing going on. We behave in a certain way because we want to be part of this community. And then gets into the education system, clean up, don't do this, don't do that, behave like this. What you get is you get a very clean, safe society that actually has a lot of, and that has a lot of benefits for things like the Toyota production system, and being very thorough in how you, and meticulous in how you execute and implement quality control at the shop floor and so forth. So so tight loose is not about one is better than the other. They're better for different things, right? So Japan is very good at societal cohesion and no crime and no littering and making great things at a high level of quality. It's not so great, as I said earlier, at breakthrough innovation, that sort of thing. But the thing is, for Japan right now, this is the reinvention. The reinvention that's happening in Japan right now is a recognition that in order to compete at the technology frontier of the digital transformation, Japanese companies have to get better at breakthrough innovation. It has to be a mindset change, that we need to be good at AI. We need to be good at these current technologies. We need to be more experimental in our setup of R&D and innovation, and we need more startups, and we need more of that. So as you just said, Dorie, that's exactly right. The universities are changing their curricula, and it's going slowly. Everything in Japan is happening slowly but certainly there are changes in curricula at the high school level, and there are more playtime at the kindergarten, more of this experimental thinking. And the University of Tokyo and other universities in Japan have top-notch curricula when it comes to AI and cybersecurity and that sort of thing. So things are changing, and Diane is right that the old education system was feeding into this monozukuri, right, the art of making things. And the reinvention of the economy is also now being slowly but certainly reflected in a reinvention of the education system. And also how young people think about their careers and their employment and what they want to accomplish in their work lives and work-life balance. And so there's this very interesting change process going on, and observers differ whether Japan is too slow and when it's slow, too slow, or whether Japan is missing out on a lot of opportunities. But if you change the lens a little bit and try to see what is actually changing, you'll see that there's a lot of quiet, steady change going on in Japan.
Yeah, thank you so much. We're here with Ulrike Schaede, a professor at the University of California, San Diego. This is our Newsweek special feature on creating the economy of the future. And if you want to learn more about Ulrike and her work, just go to her website. It's thejapanologist.com. So Ulrike, you were mentioning a moment ago the changes that are on the horizon. And a question actually came in from one of our live stream viewers who's tuning in from Nalin, who wants to know, the Japanese prime minister has recently called for a new form of capitalism that will include investments in green tech, digitization, and human capital. What do you think the motivation behind the initiatives is? What impact will it have? And should other countries be doing the same thing? What do we need to know about this new initiative and some of the future implications?
So it's a brand new initiative. It was announced 3 weeks ago. So we scholars who are trying to figure out the answers to those excellent questions are still trying to, okay, so what is this? But fundamentally, I think what's going on there is this notion that if we do it right, capitalism can be good for all. It can be good for all. It doesn't have to be dog eat dog. It doesn't have to be rich and poor. It doesn't have to lead to polarization if we do it right. So then the question is, okay, so what does doing right mean, right? And that's where, again, we're going to look at Japan, I think. So the prime minister has put together a council, deliberation council, to figure out the answers. The composition of this council is very interesting. It has a number of startup people. It has reformers. It has people that are a little bit more concerned about, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So let's keep what works in the Japanese economy. So and I think at the end of the day, what we'll learn is what they're trying to address is how can we do both? Be a society that values stability, long-term corporate growth, long-term value creation, and equality and societal cohesion. How can we marry all of that with an economy that can be, be a leader in breakthrough innovation and a vibrant sort of high metabolism economy? And the prime minister himself said that this is going to be very difficult, but if somebody can do it, maybe it's us, right? And so we are going to watch this for going forward, because I think yet again, this is something where we might be able to learn something from Japan. I think what's driving it is that, Japan used to look at America and say, well, we want to be like America. We want to have a Silicon Valley, we want to have a Wall Street, we want to have this, that, and the other thing. And right now, frankly, America isn't looking so great. I mean, Wall Street is great, stock price is crazy, but it's a little bit crazy, right? And so there are lots of people in Japan that say, well, we had this craziness, we had that in the 80s, not sure we like that craziness. Is there a different way of doing this that still would leave us better off and have us growing, that is not so polarizing and that doesn't lead to income inequalities the same way? I mean, if you compare income inequality in Japan and the United States, it's very different. It's edging up in Japan, which gives a lot of people concern, but it's nowhere near the levels of the United States. And so I think this new capitalism program is a little bit of expresses a concern that if we become too much like the United States, we'll end up with more income inequality, and that's just not something that Japanese society will accept. And in fact, you asked me earlier, why did it take 2 decades for Japan to get over its bubble? And part of the reason was that Japan needed to get over its bubble without creating a lot of income inequality. And so there are lots of stoppers in place already. And so I think this new capitalism will be an attempt to set up an economy that is good for not just one part, not just the smartest or not just the best educated, but that creates a system where everybody has a role to play, and everybody can find a spot in a good place, in a safe place, in that economic activity.
That's a really interesting observation, Ulrike. Thank you. We've been talking about creating the economy of the future. We're here with Ulrike Schaede. Check out her website at thejapanologist.com. Ulrike, one of the places where the recent experience of the United States and Japan has differed has been, of course, the past couple of years with the pandemic. Immediately coming out of the pandemic, the United States has been experiencing the great resignation with many people leaving their jobs. My understanding is that there's been much less of that in Japan. The United States and Japan reacted pretty differently from public health and shutdown perspectives with regard to the pandemic itself. Can you talk a little bit about the differences in the response and how things are looking in Japan now as we, fingers crossed, hopefully emerge into a kind of post-pandemic or quasi-post-pandemic? What's the view of things as a result of the craziness of the past 2 years?
Yeah, I mean, that's a longer topic, right? And by the way, as we speak, even California is coming out of this latest Omicron wave, but Japan is in it. So we don't actually know. But and I hopefully that our friends in Japan will do fine. The Japan has not been hit as hard by this. I mean, if you ask people in Japan, they say we were hit just as hard. But if you look at things like death per 100,000 or even cases per 100,000, Japan's immediate hit in terms of the health of the nation has not been as bad as the United States, which maybe is not saying much because the United States has been hit so hard. That's a different story, right? But Japan has done, in terms of health of the population, the pandemic has given shown us again that yes, you can have an aging society and not have a high death rate like that. But at the business level, of course, a lot has changed. A lot, because Japanese business used to be predicated on people working long hours in the office. Right? You show up in the morning and you go home late at night. And the pandemic has questioned whether that's really necessary. And so, after decades of long commutes and people kind of schlepping in the morning in these large places like Tokyo and Osaka and having 1 hour commutes in the train and so forth, suddenly Japan had to switch to working from home. This brought its own new challenges, right? Because one is that Japanese homes are small. And a lot of people, actually, this is true in many countries, right? People had to work from their bedrooms, but some Japanese apartments don't have bedrooms, right? So yes, this was hard for everybody. It caused a whole new challenge for Japan. Also, because Japanese businesses were not made for working from home, and they didn't have enough VPN accounts, and they didn't have, an IT system set up, and they had this whole, fax mentality, still paper mentality. I sometimes joke because in Japan, the word for paper is kami, and the word for gods is also kami. And in Shinto, there are lots of gods, right? Anime, spirit, and so forth. And so I sometimes joke that Japan is the country of kami and kami, gods and papers. And so Japan had to basically go cold turkey on this paper culture. And that has created a whole new outlook among young Japanese of what they want in their lives. Do they really want to go to work in the morning and come back home late at night? And a lot of young workers or older workers didn't have the liberty of saying, I want to change, because there's actually really no liquid job market for a large portion of Japan's workforce. But the younger folks are saying, well, wait a minute, what do I want to do in life? And so it's not a great resignation so much as a great opportunity to rethink what it means to be a successful Japanese business person. And this has opened up, I think, in some ways, a new sort of way of looking at what does it mean to be a successful person, a happy person, and a happy family person. And it has opened up new opportunities for women, and also for companies to rethink what it means to create work-life balance for its employees. This is something that actually the leading Japanese companies are embracing. So let's reframe this as an opportunity, not a resignation, an opportunity. Let's set up new work processes. Let's change the office design. This is something that happened prior to the pandemic, but this free address office that sometimes it's attributed to WeWork in California, the free flow of, you go in, you find a place in this beautifully styled office. Large Japanese companies in Tokyo and Osaka and Fukuoka and so forth had already started that, right? Let's make the office beautiful. Let's make the office atmosphere different. Let's pull people out of this rut of being this office worker in this tiny little, desk that is overflowing with paper and, sort of, hot and sticky and narrow, and open things up and let people focus more not on process but on outcomes. And all of this is happening right now. It's a very exciting moment for Japanese business.
It is. This is a very exciting inflection point. We are beginning to come to the end of our conversation, just a few more minutes here, but we have been here on behalf of Newsweek as part of our special series in the month of February on creating the economy of the future. It is a special series presented by the government of Japan. And we've been talking today to Professor Ulrike Schaede. You can visit her website at thejapanologist.com and learn more about her work. And if you want to make sure you never miss one of our weekly series, go to dorieclark.com/LinkedIn. You can follow me there. Ulrike, the last question that I have, you were talking about how this is in many ways a kind of, special inflection point where the future of Japanese business is being reconsidered. What does success look like? Where are we aiming? I know that for many Americans, the Japanese companies that people are most familiar with are the large international conglomerates that we were talking about earlier, the Toyotas, the Sonys. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the current state of small business and entrepreneurship in Japan. What does that look like? What are the trends and what is happening in terms of new business development that we can be looking toward?
So that's a great question. So first, the former conglomerates are changing rapidly, right? And so some people may think that Japan is gone because we don't see it anymore. It used to be that you walk into somebody's living room and there's a Sony TV and then the Panasonic and the Fujitsu and so forth. And that's no longer there. It's now Samsung or LG or, some other brand like that. But don't be fooled by this because one thing that we need to appreciate, I think, if we want to understand the world economy, is that Japan is still the third largest economy in the world. And the reason is that Japanese companies are making the very important inputs that go into these consumer end products. So Japanese companies are anchoring many of the supply chains in electronics and cars and so forth. And this more sort of upstream role has also opened up opportunities for new business creation in Japan. And again, everything in Japan is always slow. The whole innovation and startup scene started at around 2003 in full speed when the government allowed what's called the 1 yen company. So it removed basically legal capital requirements. So it's now you can open a company in Japan with paid in capital of 1 yen, which is 1 penny. So yes, it's easy to start a company in Japan. Then there were all kinds of societal constraints on that the status of working for a startup company wasn't particularly high. It was seen as a failure. You must have failed getting a job at a large company. That's why you're working at a small one. But lately, there have been a number of programs and also a recognition that one of the biggest player in any innovation ecosystem is the large companies that need to buy product from small companies. And this is something that has happened over the last 5 years. And there's an increasing recognition that large companies need to engage in the ecosystem with the small companies and appreciate what the small companies can bring to the table and buy their product, buy their technologies, buy their ideas, acquire them, merge with them. And this is something that I would recommend that we look out for. And because as that heats up, the entire Japanese innovation startup, innovation ecosystem will grow rapidly. And I think we're at the cusp of that happening, and it'll be another growth engine. And so far as that happens, it'll be a big growth engine for the Japanese economy going forward.
That is fantastic. Thank you so much for your insights today. We've been here on behalf of Newsweek in our special monthly series in the month of February, Creating the Economy of the Future. We are here at 12:30 Eastern, 9:30 Pacific every Wednesday this month, talking about the economy of the future and what we all can learn so that we can prepare. Ulrike Schaede, professor at the University of California, San Diego, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great fun. Thank you.
Thank you all, and see you next week.